Hey everybody, welcome to the Horror Trans podcast. I don't know which episode number we're on. I believe it's episode 8 or so. So, yay, we're still going. Um, this is a companion to the Horror Trans YouTube channel where I do horror reviews, horror icons, and film franchise rankings. And I say in my tagline that it's all things horror. So I started this podcast to talk about the other stuff like comic books, toys, video games, etc. that don't really fit in the format of the YouTube videos that I do. And I try to start the show off with some housekeeping, updates and stuff, what I've watched recently, and a little news and rumors. So, what have I been watching recently? Last week, I watched Friday the 13th Part 3 again in 3D. And last night, I watched Jurassic Park for my bonus Patreon commentary where I watch the movie and talk about it. So you can find that at patreon.com/Stephanie Brie. That's BRI. And it was a good movie. And I still contend that Jurassic Park is a horror movie. It's a scary movie. It absolutely is. Um, I haven't really watched any other new horror movies recently. Actually, I've, to be honest, I haven't really had time these last 2.5 weeks because we got a blizzard where I live last weekend, and that shut down the town. And my driveway I live on a private road in a trailer park, and they did not plow our road, so I was trapped for 3 days, couldn't get out, and public transit wouldn't come down our road, nor would Uber. So I was stuck, and my work schedule changed a lot that week because of the snow days, because people couldn't make their shifts and other people had to fill in shifts, etc. And so that was the last 2 weeks, and then this past week, I just been adjusting to my new work schedule and catching up, trying to get my videos back on schedule. So I have a block of videos on the weekend and a block of videos midweek, because last week I did my weekend videos on Monday and my midweek videos on Tuesday, which was not spaced out enough. And I got some feedback from that saying, hey, your videos are coming out too quickly. And I was like, yeah, I screwed up. I should have waited until Thursday to release the midweek videos, but then that would have been too close to the weekend. So it was a call I made. But here we are. Monday is podcast day. Speaking of podcasts, I have been listening to a podcast called The Horror Virgin, which is a podcast that's been going on a little while, longer than I thought. And that's an interesting podcast where they talk about how scary a horror movie is, and I kind of like that. But I won't be trying to incorporate that into my reviews. I mean, if I find a movie particularly scary, I'll say it is. And if it's like not scary at all, I might mention it as like, hey, this movie wasn't even scary at all. But a horror movie to me doesn't have to be scary to be good. And even if it is scary, it doesn't automatically make it good either. Um, if it's too scary, I'm going to give it a bad review because I'm like, hey, don't watch this movie. It's terrifying. As far as horror news and rumors, which is the segment I like to go into after what I've watched recently, there's nothing really interesting happening in the horror news. I mean, a lot of new releases and schedule changes and stuff, but it's a lot of stuff we already know about. And so I just leave that stuff to the proper news channels. I only like to pick out news articles that are like transcend horror, like the big articles that I think everybody's interested in. And the closest thing I could find to that was like Blumhouse merging with another company. But that's like 3 weeks. That story was 3 weeks old already, so I feel like it's not really news at this point. Even though I am kind of a journalist, I'm not going to be doing my own journalistic um, investigations and stories and interviews and such probably for this podcast. I'll just read the headlines and see if there's something worth talking about. The only other thing I saw that looks interesting is they're making progress on the Crystal Lake Friday the 13th television series that I'm still iffy on for a lot of reasons. But we'll see how that plays out. So let's go ahead and get into the topics. Our first topic might not be very long. It is, what is pulp horror? I had a hard time finding a definitive answer to this because I got two answers. Neither one of them were satisfying to me when I did my research. Answer number one is it's shitty stories that were published in pulp magazines back in like the 30s and 40s. Well, that doesn't really do us any good for this podcast because I don't really talk about magazines. I'll talk about comic books, but I've never read any of these so-called pulp magazines. I've never read them. These are way before my time. I have read some horror comics, but I don't really necessarily feel like horror comics fall under the category of pulp fiction, necessarily. The second definition I got was kind of vague. It is basically anything that is adapted based on those stories or done in that style. And I feel like the general consensus was short, like pulp fiction, pulp horror is like a fancy term for B movies, basically. But not necessarily. There was some argument, some disagreement on what is classified as pulp horror. Unfortunately, I don't have any definitive examples because when I was reading the examples people were putting forth, I just didn't agree with their analysis of those films as pulp. So I don't really know how to answer this question, unfortunately. And I know if you're listening to this podcast, you're like, well, that sucks. Maybe I wanted an answer. I did too, but I couldn't really get a definitive answer from the horror community. The best I could come up with is adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft's works and movies that imitate that style. So like Hereditary was an example. Reanimator was an example some people threw about. But some of the other examples are just examples of B movies and schlocky slashers. So I'm like, I don't know, maybe pulp horror is... maybe it just only refers to those stories published in those pulp magazines and there is no movie equivalent. I mean, perhaps. I mean, I'm gonna go with that for now until someone can clarify and give me a better definition. Because as it stands, I just couldn't find a consensus among the horror community. And I checked the usual sources, like Reddit and, Dread Central and places like that. And I just couldn't find a definitive, this is what we universally all agree on is pulp horror. And that's disappointing to me because I feel like it's a genre that does exist, but nobody can narrow it down and say this is an example of it and these are the traits of pulp horror. So using Hereditary and Reanimator as the examples that were the only two that were consistently brought up, I haven't seen Hereditary, so I don't know what that's like, but Reanimator to me is just like body horror. So I don't know if that's a satisfying example for me because it's like, well, does that mean body horror is pulp horror? And I loathe the term Lovecraftian. I hate that term. So I don't know, maybe pulp horror is an alternative to Lovecraftian, perhaps, like a way of describing it. Although I consider Lovecraftian more like cosmic horror. And again, I would not put Reanimator under cosmic horror. I don't think. But some of his other films, I definitely would, like From Beyond. or was it The Beyond? From Beyond or The Beyond? There's a movie called From Beyond, and there's a movie called The Beyond, and I get them mixed up. Whichever one was the Lovecraft movie, I would definitely say is cosmic horror. But we're not talking about that right now. So I guess I would say pulp horror is probably just a fancy term for schlocky B movies, or just another term for that. Um, as far as I could tell, it seems like the examples a lot of people gave, that's what they were. If we're going based on low budget pulp magazines, that would be the equivalent, a low budget, schlocky, just low rent kind of thing. So that's the best I could come up with, but that just leads you straight into the slasher genre. And I don't know if I would call slashers pulp horror. So I don't know. I guess let me know in the comments, what do you think? Is pulp horror even a thing in movies, or is it literally just magazines and comic books? I don't know. Let me know what you think. Maybe I can start a discussion and get an answer. Next question, next topic is, should horror be political? I know there are some films that are, known to be political, like Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, They Live, The Purge, absolutely, are prime examples. But then you have other movies like Would You Rather or Saw, which have a political message, but isn't necessarily like the purpose of the films. I think, as with art in general, absolutely, if the artist has a political statement they want to make, horror has a right to be political. Absolutely, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, because the spectrum isn't just left and right; it's a spectrum. Um, and the further left you get, the more right you get. The further right you get, the more left you get, because it's more like a circle than a spectrum, really. I learned this in political science, and yeah, I can see major similarities between far left extremist and far right extremist. They're basically the same thing, they just want something different. Um, Contrary to what people may believe, I'm actually pretty middle of the road. I'm very left of center on social issues and right of center on like science and technology kind of issues, whereas I want science and technology to advance, but I want it to advance in a way that is beneficial to humanity, not just for the sake of it. So like I want AI to be done in a way that can serve humanity, not just let's just do AI for the fucking sake of it. You know. Um I'm a little iffy on everything else. I don't want to get into politics. Um so for that, in that regards, I would say horror definitely has a right to be political. Now, is horror political? Sometimes a horror film will do something that isn't overtly political, but depending on where you fall on the spectrum, you're gonna think it's political because you assume the other side is pushing the agenda to try to persuade you to their side, whichever side you're on. So a movie like The Hunt might be seen as far right propaganda to somebody on the left, and a movie like, I don't know, The Underworld might be seen as far left propaganda to somebody on the right because it has a female action star in a horror movie. And I just don't know. It just depends on where you fall on the spectrum, I guess. If you see politics where there isn't. Now, should horror be political is a different question than can it be, because it absolutely can. Should it be? And I think the answer is it depends on the filmmaker. If the filmmaker has a political message that they want to convey, and they want to use horror as a way to illustrate that what the world would look like if this political ideology was put in place, regardless of what that ideology is, then that is acceptable to me. And I think that, and it should be. Yeah, absolutely. Now, should horror films be straight up government propaganda? Fuck no. Absolutely not. Never under any circumstances. Which is one of the reasons why I do actually support, in this instance, the so-called free market when it comes to art. We do need competition in art, and we have freedom of expression, so we should be free from government oversight when it comes to how we express ourselves artistically, because we have a right to our own ideas. These are our private thoughts. We have a right to share them with whoever we want. And horror is a good way to share those thoughts and ideas, you know. I think horror as cautionary tales of what it would be like if we went to one extreme or the other is a good thing, because it shows us maybe an idea of, hey, if we went too far this way, we might end up looking like this, and if we go too far that way, we might end up looking like this. So it kind of provides a, I guess you could say, checks and balance system, to use an American political term, that keeps us in the center. Now, I know if you're on the far right, the center are your enemies because they're friends with those on the left. And if you're on the far left, you don't like people in the center because they're friendly to those on the far right, which is not necessarily the case. But, I do believe in having level-headed discussions and compromise where necessary. I don't think compromise is a bad idea. I think we need to make progress where we can, but we need to make concessions to get that progress, where necessary. Because we can't just be like stubborn. We can't just dig our heels in the ground and say, no, it's my way or the highway. Because we're pretty evenly split in this country, left and right. And so it wouldn't really be appropriate with our demographic to go all the way to the left or all the way to the right, because then you're disillusioning 50% of the population whichever way you go. Now, I've said this in the past, and I'll say it again. I am a socialist, so take that what you will. But I'm not a communist, if that makes sense. And I do not believe in authoritarianism. So I think horror should be free from government oversight and also censorship. Now, I'm okay with self-censorship, like what we have in America with the MPAA, or MPA, I guess it's known as now. Where it's kind of a, hey, if you do this, we're going to give you this rating. So you have to decide, do you want that rating or do you want this rating? And you got to make some concessions to get that rating. I'm okay with that, because then it's a matter of, you know what, we're just agreeing to this. We're agreeing to make cuts, to make concessions, or we're saying, you know what, no, we'll take the higher rating. We want this to be seen as we intended. So that's where it's, up to the filmmaker. And ultimately the distributor of the film to make those decisions. All right, let's talk about the X-Files. Now, I was hesitant to put the X-Files on my list because I consider it more of a sci-fi drama than actual horror. I've seen quite a few episodes of the X-Files, and I can see how, especially the Monster of the Week episodes, can be seen as horror. But I see it more as a sci-fi drama than anything. Not even pure sci-fi, really. It's more like a political drama, More along the lines of a suspense thriller than straight horror. So the X-Files is two FBI agents that are investigating paranormal activity. And sometimes they come across something that can't be explained. And sometimes they find a rational explanation for the thing that previously couldn't have been explained. And there's a lot of government cover up bullshit in the X Files. But the overarching story is one of the FBI agents had a sister who was allegedly abducted by aliens. But all we know for certain is she disappeared at a young age. And he's obsessed with extraterrestrial activity because, for one, he's looking for his sister, or at least answers to what happened to her. And the other FBI agent is a little more level-headed, a little more like skeptical, at least in the beginning. As the show progressed, there was that iffy bullshit TV trope of will they, won't they, romantic entanglement bullshit, which I was not a fan of, because it's like, do we really fucking need that in every goddamn TV show? Come on. A man and a woman can work together and not have sex. It is a thing they can do. You don't have to bring sex into everything. So, the X-Files ran for a very long time and got a couple of spin-offs. I have no knowledge of the spin-offs. I never watched any of them. And I'm going to be honest, I only really watched the first season of the X-Files, and then I lost interest because it was a slog. You're talking 24 episodes with a very slow burn. And it's like, you got a lot of Monster of the Week filler that weren't very good, And only subtle hints at the overarching story sprinkled throughout so, sporadically that it was intended to string you along for decades, and I'm not a fan of that. I need a payoff at the end of the season. And by the midpoint of season 1, I had lost interest. Now, I've seen both of the films, the feature films, the X-Files, and I did watch the first 2 episodes of the, I would say, reboot miniseries. And then I was like, okay, I don't even know what's going on, so I'm out. So my knowledge of the X-Files is fairly surface level. What I've stated is pretty much all I know about it. As a horror fan, it kind of appeals to me, but at the same time, as I've mentioned before, it's really hard for me to get into a long-running TV series, especially one that is a slow burn. Buffy was more action-oriented from the get-go for me, and X-Files is more like a murder mystery kind of thing, and I don't enjoy that as much. So I am not a fan of the X-Files, as in, ooh, I love it and I watch it and obsess over it and theorize over it. But I don't hate it. I appreciate it for what it is, and I enjoy what I've seen of it. And God, if I had the time and the patience and I wasn't bipolar and I didn't have, crazy brain, I probably could sit down and watch X-Files. But I just can't because it is just too difficult for me to commit to that and just get into it. It doesn't hold my attention. So I'll recognize it's a great show, absolutely. It just doesn't work for me. It might work for you, and if so, that's great, good for you. I can't really get anything out of it because I can't get into it. Because it's so boring. And, I guess The X-Files is another example we were just talking about of political horror. Because the villain of the X-Files is the government. They're the ones covering it up and getting in the way of the investigations and everything else. And I do believe, at least from watching the movies, that the government is related to some kind of, I won't say extraterrestrial conspiracy. I don't think that was established. but some kind of Illuminati type situation where there's like some hidden shadow government pulling the strings. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm just not. I'm going to be honest. So having the shadow government as the villain behind the scenes just doesn't work for me. If you're going to go that route in a TV show, I'm tapping out. You've lost me. You know, so The X-Files is a great show. I enjoyed the episodes I did see up to a point, and then I lost interest. And I would jump back in from time to time when it was running to try to get caught up, and I'd ask my friends, "Hey, what's happening?" And I would try to keep up as it was going on, but not to the point where I ever knew what was going on. It was just kind of like, oh, they're still looking for his sister, and they're never gonna find her. And I felt like that thread should have been tied up in season 1, and then we could have pulled on a new thread for going forward. But it just seemed to me like they were just going to string us along for 10 or 12 seasons, or however long it went, and never give us answers. And I hate it when a TV show does that. I need fucking answers, you know? Give me a satisfying conclusion to this season, and then give me a new mystery the next season. You know, I don't want a continuous, never-ending arc where it's always open-ended and I don't get a satisfying conclusion. I hate that. I just do. So that's why I'm not a fan of the X-Files, because I'm just like, it just doesn't work for me. You know. So the next topic on the podcast is a little iffy. It's just ghost stories, campfire stories. So I've previously talked about how ghost movies, haunted house stories, and slashers, you know, the boogeyman is going to get you if you're bad, tend to be very similar to ghost stories, campfire stories. When I was a kid, I did go camping regularly with my family, and also summer camp. I did the church camp thing. One year I went to church camp as a camper, and then the next 2 years I went as a counselor because I was older and I was studying to be a minister for a time. And I thought that would get me some hands-on experience. And so I got experiences as both a camper and a counselor. And even though it was a church camp, we still told ghost stories, at least within the confines of, you know, the Bible. So we would tell Bible stories, but goose them a little bit to make them more juicy. Now, at regular camp, just like going, you know, like 4th of July weekend or family reunions or whatever, when we would go to the lake camping, ghost stories would tend to be one of my uncles or my dad, or somebody would tell a scary story. And in those regards, they were pretty much whatever they had seen on the Twilight Zone. I figured this out pretty quickly because I watched the Twilight Zone. And I was like, oh, you're just describing an episode of the Twilight Zone. But go on. I'm intrigued. So they weren't very interesting. And they weren't very scary because it was like I already knew the story, how it was going to end. Now, my older sister did a better job telling ghost stories because she was into the occult for a period. And so she read a lot of books on like the occult, you know, demon possession and satanic stuff and witchcraft and, you know, seances and those sorts of things. So she could tell really good scary stories. I am creative enough that if I was properly motivated, I could probably write a good short story, a good scary short story or novella, and I've already written a novel. I've already published it, Goldfish on the Mountain. You can find it on Amazon. So in that regards, yeah, I could tell a good scary story, but verbally, no. I can't sit down in the spotlight with a flashlight in my face and tell people live a story off the cuff. That's just not a skill set I possess, unfortunately. My experience with ghost stories are actually pretty lame. Because like I said, a lot of times it's just kids repeating stories they've heard. And it's the stories you've heard. The man with the hook, the ghost in the attic, the doll in the garden, the serial killer next door neighbor, etc. It's like it's like Alfred Hitchcock movies or episodes of Twilight Zone, like I said. Nothing too terrifying. I think to tell a good ghost story, though, a campfire story, it's really in the descriptions. You got to set the atmosphere. And I think that's where a lot of, especially kids and teenagers, just miss the mark. Because they don't really have that vocabulary yet. A lot of times. And unfortunately, none of the ghost stories I heard as a kid, campfire stories I heard as a kid, were memorable enough to stick in my brain. So, like, I can't say, oh, my favorite story is this, and then recant it, because it's like I don't have one, because I don't really remember the details of any of them. And I'm sure if I tried to tell one, I would probably be mixing up, like, 6 or 7 stories in one, and not coming up with a cohesive narrative. Or just relaying the plot of Friday the 13th, take your pick. I think as a trope, as a thing that we do in society, I think scary stories, campfire stories, ghost stories are essential to our folk storytelling. I really do. I think they are often used as, like fairy tales were back in the day, as cautionary tales to teach you a moral lesson. I don't necessarily believe I agree with every one of those moral lessons, but that's often the case, what they were intended to do or attempting to do. Now, there are a handful of movies that aren't just done in the style of ghost stories or campfire stories. They're literally based on popular campfire stories. And I can talk about a couple of them here. One of them I've already talked about previously and I've done a review on. Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left is definitely based on a campfire story. Also, Urban Legend from 1998 is based on a campfire story. Actually, a series of campfire stories. As is I Know What You Did Last Summer. Those are the 3, like, big ones. There's probably others, but those are the go-to examples I have. My favorite of the 3 is Last House on the Left as a horror movie, but as a campfire story reenacted, my favorite is I Know What You Did Last Summer. Because I think it does a really good job of bringing to life the man with a hook story in a way that is still kind of scary. And not too cliche. Although it is really cliche. It is a generic slasher. It's not a great film. I love it. I love it to death, but it's not a great film, I'll admit. Now, The Last House on the Left was loosely inspired by not just a campfire story, but I believe a Native American tale. But don't quote me on that, because I read that somewhere a long time ago, and I don't know how accurate that was. I just remember reading about it on, like, an article somewhere, a blog or something, like 20 years ago. So, I don't know how accurate that is. Using an example from Urban Legend, another film that would fall under this category would be When a Stranger Calls. But I don't know if When a Stranger Calls was based on a campfire story or the basis of the campfire story. Because it is a pretty old movie at this point. And you know how kids are. They hear something and then they just pass it on, and it just runs through the playground like wildfire. And each generation of kids thinks they're the ones that came up with it. And when you're talking like 5th graders pass it down to 4th graders, pass it down to 3rd graders, down the chain, and then you do that every year for like 40 years, it gets lost in translation, and then it's like hard to pinpoint where did it come from. So, some cliches in ghost stories. I've already mentioned the man in the hook. Another cliche is the escaped convict from a mental hospital or from prison. The escaped serial killer, which was the basis of Last House on the Left. Man with the Hook was the basis of I Know What You Did Last Summer. And they did a lot of urban legends in Urban Legend, obviously. It's the title of the film. It's the premise of the film. Most of the urban legends in Urban Legend I was not familiar with. Now, I knew about the babysitter one just because I had seen When a Stranger Calls and When a Stranger Calls Back. So I knew that story, but I just assumed it originated with that movie. Because I'd already seen the movie, both of them. And I was familiar, obviously, with The Man in the Hook because, I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I've seen, that's referenced in freaking, Nicktoons and fucking MTV and everywhere else. I mean, that's referenced all the damn time. It's spoofed all the time. I think every sitcom had a Halloween special episode where they were telling their version of The Man with the Hook. And usually making fun of the story. So that one, I believe, has just kind of been lost in translation. The origin of that story is probably not based in reality. But I don't know if it was one of those, don't go to Lover's Lane and make out with your boyfriend stories because a man with a hook is going to kill you. Or if it was, don't have sex because bad things happen because you may end up pregnant, kind of cautionary tales. And it was just their way of teaching girls not to have sex. I don't know. Which, young girls, if you are watching this, use protection. And if he says, he's allergic to latex, get a doctor's note. Don't just believe him. Because they're all going to say that. They're all allergic to latex when it comes time to bone. So don't just take a guy's word for it. That also goes for gay guys and non-binaries who experiment with males as well. Just be careful. Practice safe sex, but have all the sex you want. Don't let anybody tell you not to. Just be smart about it, because AIDS was a real thing, and it did kill a lot of us back in the day. I don't really have anything else to say about ghost stories, necessarily. Just because I kind of thought I would spend more time on some of these other topics, and I didn't. And I'm starting to realize that this format of the podcast probably isn't working for me because I'm having a hard time coming up with an hour's worth of content. And I don't want to do a 30-minute podcast because I feel like that's not worth it. That could have just been a YouTube video, which these pretty much are just YouTube videos at this point. So I have nothing else on the docket. This was pretty much my list of topics for today, and I kind of breezed through them pretty quickly. So upcoming horror films, I'll try something new. Upcoming horror films I'm interested in, or recent releases I haven't seen that I want to see. I've started to watch It's a Wonderful Knife twice. And I'm having a hard time getting through it, but I feel like eventually I'll go back and finish it. I do really want to see Thanksgiving, because I heard that one's pretty good. And I kind of want to see it. Megan is still on my list. It's in my queue on whichever streaming service it's on. I think it's Max, but I can't remember. So it's on my queue. It's on the list of things to watch. And I'm going to get to Hereditary eventually. I've had enough people request Hereditary, and it seems like, from what I understand, a movie that there's a high probability I might enjoy. So I do want to check it out. Upcoming films that I'm interested in, I do want to see I want to see what they do with Steamboat Willie. I mean, Blood and Honey was fun. It wasn't great, but it was fun. and I kind of want to see what they do with Steamboat Willie, because I think that could be fascinating. Um, the other public domain horror movies that are coming out don't interest me in the slightest. That one with the swimming pool that I just saw an ad for like last week, I can't remember what it's called. I'll have to look it up. That one looks interesting, but it looks like it could be a fake out, like something else or whatever. And so I'm on the fence because just watching the trailers, I get the feeling that it's going to be a disappointment, but I still kind of want to see it. I'm just hesitant to see it because I just don't know if it's going to be any good. I just get the feeling it's going to be like a fake out. Like it wants you to think it's one thing and then it turns out it's something else. And I just have a sneaky feeling that's what it's going to end up being. And I don't know if I want to sit through that. If it ends up being the thing I'm afraid it is. So I just don't know how I feel about that. Sequels. Well, I am still chugging through the Children of the Corn franchise. I am torturing myself to get through those. And I am still torturing myself to get through the Leprechaun and Hellraiser franchise. I have had to take a break because those movies are painful to watch. I'm going to be honest. So don't expect glowing reviews of all of them. Some of them are better than I expected. And some of them are just kind of eh. And the Puppet Master is on my list, but goddamn, there's like 15 Puppet Master movies. So I don't know if that's a realistic franchise I'll be able to get through. That's a lot of movies. That's a lot of movies. And I'm having a hard time getting through the Hellraisers, and there's only like, I think 9 of them or something like that. So I'm having a hard time with the Hellraisers. And the Children of the Corn, I'm going to be honest, I haven't even really started. I've seen the first one, but I've already seen it before. And every time I go to start Children of the Corn 2, I'm like, no. Oh, I did watch a horror movie. I forgot. And I am going to do a review of it. Actually, probably this week. I saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And I don't want to spoil the review or anything. I'm just going to say I am making my way through the Texas Chainsaw franchise as well. And most of the Texas Chainsaw films I've seen, I've really enjoyed. So I expect that will be an easier franchise to get through because most of the ones I've seen I've enjoyed. So I expect I'll probably enjoy more of them than I won't enjoy. Hellraiser has been a slog. By the time I got to 5, I was like, oh my god, why are they still making these? So that is coming. So don't worry, those are still happening. I'm trying to get through them because I want to do franchise rankings. And I'm running out of franchises to rank that I've already seen the entire franchise. And I'm still like working on my Friday the 13th and Halloween franchise rankings because I go back and forth on a couple of films in both franchises where I think about it and I'm like, yeah, I really liked it. And then when I go to rank it, I'm like, but did I like it? And so I'm still kind of on the fence. So I am working on those. My commitment is 1 a month. That's my official commitment. But obviously I'll do them as frequently as I can. So I am trying to get through several smaller franchises that only have like 3 or 4 films. Just so I have something to go through in the meantime. And I want to do Gremlins, but there's only 2 films in the franchise, and that ranking is number 1, number 2. I mean, obviously. So I'm really hesitant to do films that only have 2 franchises that only have 2 entries because it's like, well, it's just going to be the first one is the best and the second one was what the fuck. You know, that's more often than not going to be the case. Because it's very rare that a sequel is actually better than the original. Very rare. Sometimes as good as the original, sometimes pretty damn close, but very rarely better than the original. I have seen all 4 of the Jaws films, but I don't want to rank the Jaws films because they just pretty much go in order of release because they just progressively got worse. And that's, I mean, you know, spoilers, but at the same time, I mean, there's not much to spoil there because we already knew this. Although I will say this, Jaws 3D was fun. It was cheesy, but I thought it was fun. Um, so I don't know. I might mix it up a little bit. I'm trying to decide if I want to do the Jurassic Park franchise separate from the Jurassic World franchise or do them all together as one franchise because my ranking will change depending on how I do that. I did decide to do Child's Play and then separate from that the Chucky films that have the word Chucky in the name and the Child's Play ones that have Child's Play in the name because I feel like it is a continuous franchise. It's also two franchises at the same time. So I've already done that ranking. The Chucky ranking will be down the road because I haven't seen all of the Chucky films yet. Oh, they're all good films that I've seen. I mean, I've enjoyed every Chucky film I've seen, with Child's Play 3 being the exception, the one I didn't enjoy. But I feel like I want to. I like Chucky as a character, and I like what I've seen of him. So I feel like that's one I definitely want to get through. It's just a matter of priorities. You know, I only have so much time in a week, and I'm doing so much other stuff. You know, I mean, I got my toy channel, I got my vlog channel, I got my website. You know, I got to spend time with my girlfriend. You know, I got work. I work a full-time job. It's just a lot. And I work 12-hour shifts at my job. So when I get a day off, I'm wiped out and I need to rest and recover. So I don't like doing a lot of work on my days off. So those are all the things that are coming up. Just some general housekeeping. You can find me on Twitter at StephanieBree22. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/StephanieBree. I do once a month, I do a Zoom Q&A, Ask Me Anything. And I also do, guaranteed once a month, I'll do a bonus audio commentary. But I tend to do those every week or every other week. So I've been doing 2 or 3 a month. But it's been 3 weeks since I've done one, and I just did Jurassic Park last night, so that one's coming later today. So that is coming. And then my book, Goldfish on the Mountain, it is a horror thriller about 2 brothers who are murderers, and one of them wants to be a serial killer. And they kidnap a woman and do some bad things to her. And she tries to escape, and it's pretty interesting. I think you should check it out, Goldfish on the Mountain. It's on Amazon. That's the show. Unfortunately, that's all I have. I'm not going to sit here and ramble for another 20 minutes. So that's the episode. Stay cool.